There are so many fonts and typefaces out there that people either go crazy and use as many as they can get their hands on, or they're overwhelmed and stick to the default that they're given. If you're doing the former, your documents probably look pretty bad. And if you're doing the latter, your documents could look better. So then, how should you choose your fonts? What rules should you follow? As with any design, unless you're required to follow a style guide, there aren't any hard and fast rules. But there are some rules, in quotation marks, that will steer you in the right direction. Here's one that I heard when I was starting to learn about typeface and design. Use sans serif fonts for screens, use serif fonts for printing. I heard this years ago in a conversation about design. It was presented as a kind of typography commandment. Sans serifs are easier to read on screens, and serifs are easier to read on paper. This rule makes sense when you look at the low-resolution screens of old word processors, like this one from the 1998 movie Croupier. There are some serifs there, but they look pretty bad. But nowadays, the resolution on the worst smartphone is literally thousands of times better than that. We can do serifs on screens now. But is there a legibility reason for choosing one over the other? Actually, no. Alex Poole has an excellent literature review of several studies on serif versus sans serif on his website. He concludes that there have been study after study with findings of no difference, and most reasonably designed typefaces in mainstream use will be equally legible, and that it makes more sense to argue in favor of serif or sans serif typefaces on aesthetic grounds than on the question of legibility. All that said, sans serif fonts are still much more popular on the internet, and books are usually printed with serif fonts. So there are norms to follow, but you won't be sent to typography jail for breaking this rule. A more important rule to follow is use typefaces for their intended purposes. Every good typeface is designed with an intention and destination in mind. You can usually find this intention in its description. In Google Fonts, this is under About and License. Some words to look out for are general use, which means that you can use this font in paragraphs and longer text, and display, which, as you can guess, means you should really only use it for things you want on display, headlines, logos, etc. Usually displayed typeface descriptions are a little bit more colorful, so they can help you decide if you're on the right track when choosing one. Like this one for the ribeye typeface. It mentions cartoon tattoo, playfulness, and an edgy attitude. So if you weren't able to judge for yourself, this definitely tells you not to use it on an application for the university provost. So after you've found your typefaces, the next rule is to use only 2 of them per page. Trust me, you don't need any more than that. Even 3 can start to look sloppy. And notice that I said 2 typefaces per page, not fonts. Here I'm using the stricter definitions. Remember that typefaces are the general style and fonts are the variations, bold, thin, etc., of those typefaces. So if you must, you can use different fonts of one of the 2 typefaces you choose, but try to just stick with 2. Take a look at some of the most popular websites and you'll see that very few use more than 2 typefaces. The next rule is to use contrast, and there are several ways to do this. The first is to use typeface and font contrast. Now that you have your 2 typefaces, make them different. Serif and sans serif are a good contrast. So are bold and normal fonts, or normal and thin. Contrasting a displayed typeface with a general use typeface can be great too. The goal is just to create the contrast in style. Another kind of contrast you can use is size. I think this is something that most people know how to do, but it's a good reminder. Make your headings bigger than your body text. When you have multiple headings, use descending sizes to match their descending order. Use color contrast. Here, I don't mean contrast between heading and body content. I'm talking about the contrast between background color and font color. Black on white is a classic because it works. It's the easiest to see whether on screens or printed. White on black works for screens, but obviously you don't want to print that unless you're trying to get rid of printer ink. For everything else, just make sure that there's enough contrast. There's nothing worse than squinting at a long paragraph of text with horrible color contrast. If you're not sure if there's enough contrast between your background and text, I'll cover how to use a contrast checker tool in the next video. So that's it for contrast, but I want to back up a little bit to talk about the next rule. Use heading styles. Remember when I said to use contrast between your headings and body text? The best way to do this is with heading styles. These are under the Styles pane in Microsoft Word or the Style dropdown in Google Docs. You can set your styles and then use them throughout the document anytime you need a new heading. Why should you do this? First, it saves you a few clicks and helps you remember your styles so you don't have some headings that are 14 point and others that are 16. But it also is good for accessibility. Behind the scenes, it adds heading tags to the document. These make it easier for users who have screen readers to navigate through the content. While we're on the topic of accessibility and navigation, here's another important rule. Underline links, but avoid underlining anything else. Don't underline words for emphasis. Use italics for that. Don't underline headings. Make them bigger, bolder, or a different typeface. Why? Because nowadays, if there's any underlining at all, it usually means it's a link. So those are the rules of font and typeface. Of course, in design, rules are meant to be broken. But now, if you break those rules, you'll be breaking them intentionally. So you better have a good reason to do it. Otherwise, follow these rules and you can't go wrong.